Welcome to the webinar, Building Students' Word Knowledge, How to Teach Essential Words. We're going to give folks just a few minutes to hop onto the webinar before we begin. As you come in, if you'd like to go ahead and get into on chat and tell us your name and where you're from, we'd appreciate it. Someone from Prescott, Arizona, New York, Pennsylvania. From Brisbane, Australia, New Jersey, Bahamas. Do you see that? Yeah, it's great.
Oh my gosh.
From Canada. I know, it's great. Arkansas, another Canadian, Illinois, California. This is great. Welcome.
Malaysia. Oh my goodness.
Kansas, New York, Connecticut. It's great.
That's amazing. Texas.
Virgin Islands, New Jersey, Mexico, Alabama. Some are going fast. I can't see them. Illinois. Welcome. Welcome to everyone. Upstate New York, Texas. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar series, Spotlight on Structured Literacy. My name's Kim Day, and I'm a member of the IDA Georgia Board of Directors. We're joined this evening also by Nicole Vella. You'll see her in a bit. She is president of the Reading League Georgia. And on behalf of the boards of the Reading League and also IDA Georgia, we're pleased to be offering this series. This marks the Reading League and IDA Georgia's second year working as partners to provide webinars focused on structured literacy and the science of reading and writing. So we're pleased for this exciting partnership. I also want to say a special thanks to Nicole Vella. She's been with us, working with us for 2 years now, helping secure speakers and setting up the webinars. Tonight, she's going to be supporting this webinar by monitoring a chat box for questions and also helping facilitate the Q&A with Dr. Stevens. I also want to thank both the Reading League and also IDA Georgia board members who worked to put these webinars together, many of you behind the scenes, and we wouldn't be able to have these if not for your support. The Reading League and IDA Georgia are committed to providing information on evidence-based practices to educators, parents, and advocates. In doing so, we hope all students will have access to structured literacy instruction. In this 4-part series, our speakers discuss how to most effectively instruct literacy based on the science of instruction and what content to include to ensure that students become competent readers and writers. The first speaker in the series was Dr. Anita Archer. She focused her presentation on joining the science of reading with the science of instruction. The second speaker was Dr. Sharon Vaughn, and Dr. Vaughn talked to us about the science of reading comprehension. The third webinar was led by Dr. Tony Ann Vroom and Dr. Dina Zaleo, who provided information on the Hockman method, which provides evidence-based strategies for teaching students how to become more effective writers, including how to connect reading to writing when teaching content. If you were unable to attend, or if you attended and would like to rewatch the webinar or share with a colleague, you can access the recordings of these webinars on IDA Georgia's website. And also on the website, you'll find copies of the presentation slides and any resources that the speakers have shared with us. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Stevens, will talk with us about the importance of providing vocabulary instruction across content areas and the role of word knowledge for students' reading comprehension. Before we begin, though, let me thank you, all of you who submitted questions when you registered for the webinar. As a reminder, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat box, As I already mentioned, the chat will be monitored, and Dr. Stevens will address as many of your questions as she's able to during the Q&A. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Stevens. Dr. Stevens is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Sciences at Georgia State University. She completed her doctoral degree at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds a master's degree in special education from the College of William and Mary and a reading specialist degree from the University of Virginia. Prior to pursuing her doctorate, Dr. Stevens taught special education for 9 years. She has coordinated large-scale research projects at the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk and recently served as co-principal investigator of an IES-funded development and innovation project, Middle School Matters, which you'll hear more about later, which focused on, which focused on developing a PD model to support middle school teachers with implementing research-based practices during content area reading instruction. Dr. Stevens has extensive experience in designing literacy interventions for diverse and at-risk populations, providing professional development to districts, and examining the effects of such interventions and professional development through high-quality research studies. Dr. Stevens has published in numerous journals, including the Scientific Studies of Reading, Exceptional Children, the Journal of Learning Disabilities, Reading and Writing, Remedial and Special Education, and Teaching Exceptional Children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Stevens.
Oh my goodness, thank you
Yours.
so much. I appreciate that, Kim. Thank you so much. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. Let me advance, let's see, my slide here. And if you have not already introduced yourself in the chat, I know many of you have, I would just love to see who's here. And I agree with Anthony that I would also love to switch locations with the person from the Virgin Islands. So that's amazing. I'm so happy that all of you have chosen to take some time out of your evening to be here with us and with me to talk about vocabulary instruction. I'm really excited to spend the next hour and a half with you so that we can dig in and talk about what works for kids. And I hope to have time to answer your questions at the end. So please, write those down as we go along. I want to extend a big thank you to IDA Georgia and Reading League Georgia for organizing this. And a special thank you to Mary, Kim, and Nicole, and everyone else behind the scenes who put a lot of work into making this happen for you all. So thank you for organizing those efforts. I do also want to just briefly acknowledge some of the resources that you're going to see in the slides and that I will share with you tonight in the PowerPoint were developed as part of that Middle School Matters project that Kim mentioned. And that was a grant that was awarded to University of Texas at Austin. So I just want to acknowledge the funding source there with that work. The other thing that I want to say is, please, if you are on Twitter, tweet about this session, find me there. I would love to connect with you in that space. I specifically created that Twitter account and got on Twitter really for the reason of trying to translate research to practice. So when I got into my doctoral work, I realized just how much I didn't know as a teacher. And so really my effort on Twitter and in that space is to make research digestible and usable and to get it directly in the hands of teachers. So please check that out. And I hope that you will engage with me in that space. So let's talk first about what our objectives are for our time together today. We are, by the end of this session, I want you to be able to do the following things. So to identify tiered words, explain how to select which words to teach. That's kind of the million-dollar question that I know a lot of you are wondering about. Identify the components of explicit vocabulary instruction, and then also create a vocabulary map for instruction. So part of that's going to be also identifying those sections of the map and how you would teach them. So some of you are going to be coming in with different levels of existing knowledge about vocabulary instruction, and I would love for you to set an intention for yourself going into this session for what is going to work for you. So maybe you already know about tiered words. That's great. Maybe you want to really focus on selecting which words to teach. So figure out what works for you within these objectives and really set that intention as we get started. I also love to have an advanced organizer. I want to know where we're headed. And as an attendee, I want to know what the plan is. So here's the plan. We are going to talk about why vocabulary instruction is important. We're also going to talk about what word learning is, how students learn different, how they learn words. We will then discuss a routine for teaching essential words. So once you know how to, or once you've identified the words that you want to teach students, how do you then go forward and teach those words? So we're going to talk about a routine that's consistent for you and also for students. And I will then model for you how to teach that vocabulary map, also routine in action. So I will show you what that might look like. And then I'm going to conclude with giving you some helpful tips for creating those maps, because they can be a little bit more challenging than it may seem. And finally, I have several resources that I want to share with you. So a couple of notes before we get started that I want to be sure to mention to you is that the slides and the resources will be available to you after the presentation. So if you're wondering about that, I'm just going to tell you that right now, they will be available. Don't feel that you have to furiously take notes to the extent that it is useful for you. But again, those slides will be available to you, as well as the vocabulary map template. So if you're wondering about that, the templates will also be available. You'll get all of it. I'll share it all with you. The other thing I want to mention is this is going to be a bit of a crash course. It's a lot of information. I work with my graduate students at Georgia State, and we cover this content across 2 class sessions, which is about 5 hours worth of instruction and learning. So just keep that in mind. If it feels like a lot, it's because it is, but I'm going to do my best to break it down for you. And just, stay with me. As Dr. Archer would recommend, I'm going to try to keep a perky pace. And then know that this routine that I'm going to show you is usable with students across the grade levels. So I will show you a routine and a vocabulary map that you can use with elementary students, and then also middle and high school students. So if you're wondering about, will this be applicable to my grade level? The answer is yes. So just a few kind of important notes that I wanted to share before we really get rolling. So let's go ahead and dive into the first section of what I want to talk about with you all, which is why is vocabulary instruction important? So when I was teaching, I think I undervalued the importance and the role of vocabulary for students' reading comprehension. And I just didn't know. And it's always important, I think, to ground our practices and theoretical models of reading that are also rooted in evidence. So the simple view of reading, many of you are probably already familiar with this, but the simple view of reading identifies 2 components that are necessary for reading comprehension. So we have decoding, and we also have language comprehension. So what's interesting about this is that it's a multiplicative relationship. So what that means is that students need to have both in order to understand what they're reading. So they need decoding skills, meaning they have to be able to read the words on the page, reading the text, and then they also have to have language comprehension. So that has to do with oral language. Do you understand what's being said aloud? What's included in this also is background knowledge. So what knowledge do students bring to the table about an existing topic, and vocabulary knowledge. So what we're talking about tonight has to do with this language comprehension piece of the simple view of reading. And I'll talk a little bit more about, related to kind of word learning pieces where this falls into play. The other thing I want to mention is within the topic of dyslexia, when we talk about students that have word level reading difficulties, we often emphasize, and rightfully so, explicit word reading and spelling instruction, because that's what this population needs. And what I have here on the slide is the definition of dyslexia that's commonly used and recognized by IDA and ICHD, and is most, I think, widely used and accepted in terms of defining dyslexia. And we know that the primary issue is a word level reading issue. So students have difficulty reading words at the word level. But what often gets left out of this that I want to call your attention to, or gets left out of kind of sometimes the discussion, or we don't think about it as much, are the secondary consequences. So when students have difficulty reading, they often avoid it, right? You know, when things are hard for us, we kind of don't want to do it. And that's understandable, but there are ramifications to that. So when students are reading less text, they're not exposed to as many words. They're not exposed to wide range of vocabulary by reading a lot. And so there are secondary consequences then in students' reading comprehension, in part because they're not developing their vocabulary and their background knowledge simply because they're not reading enough and as much as students without word level reading difficulties. So this is an important piece related to, I think, addressing the needs of students that have word level reading difficulties that we don't want to forget about. And when we think about structured literacy, you know, we can implement word reading instruction in a structured way, but we can also do that with vocabulary instruction. And so that's what we're going to learn about tonight. Now let's move on to our second topic in our agenda, which is to talk a little bit about word learning. So I want you to think about word learning in terms of these three buckets. So students learn words kind of in three main ways. So the first is intentional. And what you can think of in terms of intentional word learning is what we're going to learn tonight and what you would do. So as you're teaching students. So it's direct and explicitly teaching students new words. These other two buckets, incidental and wide reading, incidental instruction can be thought of as indirect. Both of these are more indirect methods, incidental and wide reading. So incidental word learning is, you know, if you think about you're doing a read aloud or you're reading a text to students and a word comes up that students don't really know. So you might just briefly give a definition or an explanation as an aside, and then you continue reading the text. So that's kind of, you know, something that comes up, you know, just in the moment and naturally during discussion, but you're not explicitly directly teaching that word. So that's what we would call more incidental word learning. And then actually students learn most of their new vocabulary through indirect ways. So rich oral language experiences, independent reading, and also through read aloud. So students learn a lot of new words just by reading independently themselves, doing wide reading. So that's one of the reasons why for students that have word level reading difficulties, it's so important that we think about vocabulary instruction, because that can be a secondary consequence for students that have reduced exposure or time in text when we think about students with dyslexia. So all of these, even though students primarily learn through incidental and wide reading and indirect methods, we're going to talk about intentional word learning tonight. And how do you provide direct and clear instruction and vocabulary in a way that gets those words to stick, where students really hold on to the meaning of those words? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is talk a bit about vocabulary knowledge along a continuum. So you'll see here on the slide, and let me note that when you guys see this icon in the top right corner of these two people chatting, this is an opportunity for you to jump in the chat. So I want you to, and you guys can't see each other's comments, but I can see your comments. So I will be able to see your responses and then can share out with the group. So please engage in the chat and share your answers so that I can get a check on your understanding and where you're at related to the content that we're covering. So I want you to think about vocabulary knowledge on a continuum. And on one end of that continuum, we have, we're going to rate it as a 1, which means I've never seen or heard that word before. A 2 means I've heard it, but I don't really know what it means. 3 is I vaguely know the meaning and I can associate it with a concept or context. And then a 4 is I know that word really well and I can explain it to others, and I can also use it and apply it in multiple contexts. So I want you to think about that continuum, and I'm going to put a list of words up here on the slide. So the first word is affix. And what I'd like you to do is drop in the chat what your rating is. So think about your own word knowledge for that word. How would you rate your knowledge of that word? Oh, good. So many of you are at a 4. Excellent. So you know that word well and you can explain and use it. Great. Love that. All right. Now let's go to the next word. What about context? How would you rate your depth of vocabulary knowledge for context? Okay. So again, we have some 3s and a lot of 4s. Excellent. What about dyslexia? The word dyslexia. Yeah, the chat, you guys, is just like firing away. Everybody's 4, 4, 4. That's amazing. Great. I'm so glad that you guys can know that term and can explain it well. That's excellent. All right. What about fricative? Okay, so here I'm seeing a bit more variation. So a lot of 1s, some 2s, some 3s. So you all don't have depth. It seems that this group, from what I can see in the chat, does not have deep understanding of that word. And maybe you've never heard that word, or maybe you've heard it, but you can't really explain it. And that's understandable because it's pretty specific to speech and language. So, okay. So prosody, let's do the last one, prosody. I'm curious about this one. All right, so again, we have a lot of 4s, some 3s. Oh, okay. So we're all over the spectrum with that one, which is interesting and actually kind of what I would expect. So, all right, so keep this in mind, and I want you to now think about your students. So your students are also going to have word knowledge along this continuum. So I think that that's important, and we're going to use this to frame the type of instruction that we're going to provide to students. So I want to now shift to kind of using some terms rather than our 1 to 4 rating. So we're going to categorize these as having surface level knowledge of a word, shallow knowledge, or deep knowledge of a word. And one other way to think about this, I want to share this slide with you all. And this is a slide that I actually borrowed from my colleague, Dr. Christy Austin. She's at the University of Utah. And she created this slide, and I think it's a really, really helpful illustration of this continuum with a specific word example. So I asked her if I could share this with you all, and she agreed. So if we think about the word benevolent, a surface level understanding would be, I've heard that word before. You might have a general awareness of the part of speech or the connotation of the word, and you might know that it means something good, but that's kind of it. That would be a surface level understanding of that word. A shallow understanding of the word benevolent would be more of a definitional knowledge in one context. So benevolent means being generous with your money. I heard that word in this movie that was talking about how benevolent the king was because he shared his wealth with the people. So more understanding of the word, but still not what we would call deep knowledge. So deep understanding of this word would mean that an individual would have knowledge of the affixes and roots, be able to explain this word and have an understanding of the multiple meanings or multiple contexts and uses of that word. And you can see the examples there in blue. So I think that this is a really helpful way for us to frame our understanding of instruction for students, because what we're aiming for is depth in vocabulary knowledge and understanding for students. So when we're teaching words intentionally, we want students to know those words in a way that falls on, the right hand end of that continuum. So that's our aim. And so our practices need to align with that. And we need to do things that will facilitate students' depth in vocabulary understanding. All right, so what I'm going to do now is talk about tiers. So some of you, my guess, are coming in with knowledge about, the tiers or how we can categorize words into tiers. So if this is a review for you, great. If this is new to you, please jump in when we get to the next slide. So we want to think about words, and this is going to help us with that question that you all have about how do I select which words to teach. So this is going to help us get there. This is a really important understanding for you to have that is brought to us by Beck and colleagues. So I want to be sure to credit the source. But let's think about these three categories. So first, let's talk about tier 1 words. So as a part of word learning, these tier 1 words are words that we can assume that students know, and they know them well. So we don't need to teach them. Tier 1 words would be very basic words, like you can see the examples on the slide: clock, baby, happy, walk. Other words might be car, birthday, those words that most students tend to know. And then let's jump over and talk about tier 3 words. So tier 3 words can be defined as follows. They are infrequently used, so we don't see them very often. They tend to be very specific to a particular domain or content area. And they're just not, students aren't going to encounter them very often, except when they're maybe learning that specific content area. And then tier 2 words, which you see in the middle of the slide here, examples are coincidence, absurd, industrious, fortunate. So these tier 2 words are words that are high frequency, so students will see them often, and they're also used across domains or content areas. And they also may have multiple meanings. So the reason that this is important is because when we're selecting words to teach, we want to focus on these tier 2 words because they're widely used, they're used frequently, and they're often have multiple meanings and are important for content area learning. So when you're thinking about which words to teach, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, I want you to be thinking about words that are tier 2 words. But let's practice this, identifying words within each tier. So get your chat box ready on the next slide. But before we jump to that, the one caveat that I want to say about tier 1 words is we can safely assume that tier 1 words, most students are going to have knowledge of those words and don't need to learn them. But the caveat to that are English learners. So, some English learners will need to be explicitly taught tier 1 words as well. So that, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind. And you all know your learners best, so you're going to have to, decide that and think about that as you move forward and as we're talking through the content for tonight. Okay, so get your chat box ready because we see that icon again in the top right corner. In thinking about identifying tiered vocabulary in the text, I want you to briefly read this passage on the water cycle, which we're going to use throughout our conversation tonight in order to select words and then to show you what the vocabulary instruction might look like. So we're going to come back to this passage, but I want you to first scan this passage, and I want you to drop in the chat box 1 or 2 words that you would identify as a tier 1 word in this passage. So what is 1 or 2 words that you would identify as tier 1? Okay, so I see many of you have chosen water. Good. River, earth, ice. Okay, so a lot of people have chosen water, oceans. Just give people a chance here to living places. Okay, so I agree with most of you. Some of those we'll talk about. All right, so now let's shift to tier 3. So remember, tier 3 words are those words that are really specific. Teresa, you are on it. Very good. Right away, she dropped that in there. So the tier 3 words are those words that are very specific to content areas and infrequently used. Okay, so many of you have identified hydrology. I saw vapor. Atmosphere, I think that one is a little debatable. Environment, also debatable. But good. I would for sure agree with you guys on hydrology. Okay, so we have tier 1 and tier 3 covered. Now let's think about tier 2. So I want you to think carefully. Tier 2 are words, again, that are frequently used, occur across, you guys are rocking it. Awesome. Across content areas and may have multiple meanings. So I see a lot of you have chosen distribution. And I see environment and atmosphere. So I think those are maybe better as tier 2 words. A lot of distribution. Surface, I think that's a good one too. Great. Okay. So great. So Jean just dropped in the chat something. I've seen only a couple people choose state. And I know that that would not be a word that we would typically think of for this passage, but let's talk about why state might be a good word to teach for this passage. So when you think about this, yeah, good, Alice, excellent. That's right. It's a multiple meaning word. So let's just break this down. Look at, we can think of state as a nation or a territory, right? Like I'm in the state of Georgia. We can think about it as a condition of someone or something. So the state of affairs. There's also another meaning of state, which is a physical condition. That's what relates to this particular passage, right? So evaporated water is in a gaseous state. And then we have agitated or an anxious condition. Man, they're in such a state because they're moving next week. And then finally, we have when you state something aloud. So when you express something in speech or writing, he stated that the policy begins next semester. So, you know, at first glance, that maybe wouldn't be a word to choose. But for this particular passage, that's a pretty important word with a meaning that students are likely unfamiliar with. So it's just, I think, gives us pause. I 100% agree with you guys on distribution and a lot of the other words that you chose, that you dropped in the chat. But I think this is one that we want to be thoughtful about and careful with, because at first glance, it may not seem like something that we need to teach, but because of it being the nature of this being a multiple meaning word, it would be important to teach it. All right. So let's shift now. We've talked about word learning, and we've also talked about why vocabulary is important. Now let's dive into what this routine looks like. So this routine for teaching essential words is rooted in developing depth in word knowledge. So when you think about that continuum, we're aiming for developing students' deep word knowledge. So that means that we're not just going to provide a definition. We want to provide rich information about words with a lot of opportunities for students to practice. So frequent and varied opportunities for students to practice. We also want students to be actively engaged in this process as they're learning the words, and ultimately increase their language comprehension, right? If we go back and think about the simple view of reading in those two components. So that's our goal with this routine. And let me now talk a little bit about these practices that you'll see on this slide. So experts have identified these components as practices that are effective for, or aspects of vocabulary instruction that should be included in effective vocabulary instruction. So, and you'll see the citations that I have there on the bottom of the slide, and several of these I'm going to share with you because they're further explained in depth in some of the IES practice guides that I think might be really useful for you all. You can read more about them. But these are, when you think about how to teach essential words in a way that will develop students' deep understanding of those words, these are the kinds of things you want to do. And you want to have a routine that includes these components. So I'm going to show you some options for that in a second, but let's unpack this a little bit. So first off, you want to provide student-friendly definitions. Please don't ask students what they think the word means or what the word means, because if you're directly teaching it, then you need to provide that information to students. So just, you know, let's not waste time with that, and let's tell them a student-friendly definition. Also, effective vocabulary instruction incorporates components of morphology. So I know that in Dr. Vaughn's session, she talked a little bit about morphemic analysis, but this is a really helpful word learning strategy and reinforces students' skill in inferring the meaning of unfamiliar words because they have knowledge of these word parts. So for those of you that may not know what that word means, a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. And so you can think about parts, prefixes and suffixes are morphemes, and they carry meaning. So un means not in the word unkind. Re means to do something again in the word reread. So when students have knowledge of these morphemes and the meaning that's tied to those morphemes, it helps them to infer the meaning of unfamiliar words. Yeah, I agree. With Rachel, she said it's fun, and it is. So I think having knowledge of morphology and being able to apply morphemic analysis is fun for students to do. And we want to incorporate practices that get them engaged and excited also about word learning. So also we want to use, give students a lot of opportunities to practice using and applying the words. That's really important, practice opportunities. We always want to teach these words, not just sort of willy-nilly, I'm going to pull these words out of the air because I think you should know them. We want to teach them tied to text, and even more important, tied to content area text. So, students' knowledge building is really important. So we want them to be doing a lot of reading across content areas, but that means that they're going to need the vocabulary, knowledge, and understanding to understand those passages and to learn that content. So it's really important for us to make sure that we're selecting words that are tied to the text that students are reading. We also want to emphasize quality over quantity. So I'm going to answer that question about how many words. I know many of you have questions about that. So we'll talk about that in a second. But again, we're going for depth in vocabulary understanding versus, curricula that sometimes have 10 to 15 words in a week, which, as and think about your own word learning. I know this is true for me. When I come across a word that I don't know and I look it up, I can't then go use it and apply it the next day. I mean, I really have to have multiple exposures and see that word in different ways and sort of practice it. And so I think it's the same for students, right? We don't want them to just have a surface level. We want them to have a deep level of understanding. Examples and non-examples, illustration or concrete representation of the word, and then multiple exposures, which I mentioned just a second ago. So those are the components that we're looking for. And I think you'll see these in the vocabulary map options that I am going to show you. So now I want you to think about how this instruction occurs. So we want to use this routine as part of a before, during, and after reading lesson structure. So this slide may look familiar to you because I know Dr. Vaughn in her presentation had a similar slide. And it's a helpful way to organize practices that are effective for supporting students' reading comprehension. So before reading, we'll provide explicit vocabulary instruction and build students' background knowledge. During reading, we want to use those practices that help students to monitor for meaning and to identify key ideas in the text. And then after reading, we might come back to the vocabulary instruction. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that looks like more in a second, but I do want to highlight that this should be tied to text reading. And it should also, be structured in a way where you're going to pre-teach these words. So let's look at this essential words routine. So, what this means is that you're identifying these important words that students need to know in order to understand the text, and you're going to pre-teach those. You're going to use a simple graphic organizer or a routine. I just like to call it a vocabulary map. And you might be familiar with something similar to this, maybe the Freyr model or other organizers like this. And if you have one that you already use and that seems to work for you, that's fine. You don't have to use the one that I'm sharing with you. Do what works for you. You just want to make sure that your routine is rooted in these practices that we talked about, because that's those are the practices that we want to use in order to develop students' depth in word knowledge and understanding that will support their comprehension of text. All right, so in this essential words routine, what does it include? So we have the key important vocabulary, student-friendly definitions, oftentimes synonyms and antonyms, or there might be related and unrelated words. I'll show you that. Examples and non-examples. So that could be within the context of sentences, but also images. And then there's multiple opportunities for students to practice. This is practicing in multiple modalities. So aloud and discussion or talking with a partner. Also in writing, we want students to be practicing using and applying these words in writing. And then through word building. So that again connects to that morphemic analysis. Okay, so I just want to note that Hillary commented that the morphemic analysis teaching students morphemes is really helpful when they're reading independently. And it really helps them with understanding the words that they encounter when they're reading independently. I totally agree, Hillary, and I'm glad you shared that. Okay, so if you remember, a lot of you identified distribution as an important word to teach. And so this is a map that we created, my colleague and I, Phil Capon, that aligns with that text and teaches the word distribution. So what you'll notice about this is the format of this map is structured before, during, and after reading in the same way that we would teach it sort of in that lesson outline that you saw on the prior page. Lauren, I'm so glad you love it, and I'm going to share it with you for free. So you do not have to purchase it. I will tell you where to do that at the end. And what's really cool is that I have this available as an editable, how's that for a word? Editable PDF, so that you guys can just go into the PDF and create these for you. So yeah, absolutely, you guys. I'm glad that this will be useful. That's the goal here. So, all right, so let's break this apart and let's look first at what this contains and how this aligns with those practices that we talked about on a previous slide. So, before reading, one thing that I didn't tell you guys is I want you to notice these icons here. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. Actually, though, you know what I can do is use my pen feature, because I'm going to do that later as well. So you'll see these icons here. There's a teacher, and then here's the student sitting down reading the book, reading the text or a book, and then here we see two students. So that is a cue for you and how each of these sections of the map are to be implemented. So this initial top part is teacher-led. So you want to be leading the instruction for this top part of the map. During reading, students are going to do that part because you see them sitting there with the text in front of them. And then the after reading portion is not teacher-led, but really done in partner work or small groups of maybe 3 students. And so those icons, hopefully, they're helpful to me. So hopefully they will be helpful to you as well. All right. So let's talk about each of these sections, and just going to do a little, I'm trying to manage my time, make sure I get through everything here. So in terms of this map, I want you to first take a look at the definition or explanation box. So what we have here is a student-friendly definition for the word distribution. This may include, when you're doing this routine, you may provide a brief explanation of the term, which I'll show you when I teach the word state in a couple of slides. And then students are going to underline important words in that student-friendly definition that are important for them to understand. So in box 2, we have an illustration. So the key here is this is a visual reference to help students understand the meaning of the word. So, you want to select something, and the aim here is to remind students, first of all, to have a visual illustration of the meaning of the term, but also to help cue them that when they're thinking about distribution, think about that illustration that was on the map to help you remember the meaning of the word. The context boxes, and I think some of you, I can see that some of you have questions about this. So this can be done in a couple of different ways. And when we get to the section about creating the maps, I'll give you a bit more guidance on that. But you can have examples and non-examples here. You can also have examples that relate to students' lives. You can have an example that relates to the particular or that relates to the content area. So an example that's connected to the specific content, and then an example that's connected to students' lives. You can also have two different definitions of the term if it's multiple meaning term, which is what's happening here in these two examples for distribution. So one is more passing out versus the distribution of something, say the distribution of wealth, like how something is spread out. So it's very it's a bit nuanced, but those are different meanings of that term, which is why this is included here. So the goal here is for students to identify which of these sentences uses distribution in line with our science definition. And the answer to that would be B. So section 4 here is synonyms and antonyms. And I'm going to tell you right now that I would change this. So, even as I'm doing this, I think about ways that I can improve the map. So I'm just, as you get going with this, be kind to yourself, because you will likely find things as you're teaching it or as you go that you would change. And I'm constantly sort of, and that's what we do as teachers, right? We go back and we revise things and we try to make them better. So I think there's nothing wrong with synonyms and antonyms, but I think it's better framed as related and unrelated words, because it's important for students to make these connections, sort of these word web connections. And I think sometimes words there aren't direct synonyms. And it's helpful to listen to students' reasoning about why a word may be related or unrelated to distribution. And sometimes they can make good arguments for words that you might have said was otherwise. So anyways, I think framing that in a little bit of a different way is really helpful. And then let's see here, the word parts. So this is again, coming back to and reinforcing that morphemic analysis. So for distribution, an example, here of would be when they get to step 2 of circling the suffixes, identifying shun. And shun in this word means a process of, so the process of distributing or how water is distributed, throughout the environment and the life cycle. So that's a really important way for words that lend themselves to morphemic analysis, that you can incorporate that and give students practice with that. So this is the top portion of the map that's teacher-led, that you're going to lead and explicitly teach. And then during reading, students will read the text and highlight the vocabulary word when they see it in the text. And then finally, after reading, students come back to the map, and there are a couple of sections here. So in a partner or a small group of 3, I probably wouldn't recommend doing it larger than that. They're going to write a powerful sentence that uses the word. A key piece here is you don't want them copying the definition. That's not helpful. And you don't want them copying either of those context sentences. So they have to write a new application of that word in writing. And what's nice about doing all 3 of these boxes after reading is that students now have the content knowledge that they've learned from the passage. So they can write a sentence that's connected to what they learned in the passage, and hopefully apply that term appropriately given what they learned about the water cycle. So the turn and talk, you'll notice there are 2 here. So this is a very brief, it is not, if you're looking at this and thinking there's not enough space for them to write, that's because it's not written, it's done aloud. Students actually turn and talk to each other, and everybody has an opportunity to answer the question, and it should take no more than 1 to 2 minutes. So it's a very quick, brief exchange, and then you come back together. That first turn and talk, you'll notice this icon here for the notebook is connected to what students are learning related to hydrology and the water cycle. And then here, this question connects to students' everyday lives. So they're applying that term in multiple ways. The principal gives extra recess time to students in grades K through 2. Do you think that's a fair distribution of recess time? Explain why or why not. And then we give, and this is really helpful for your English learners, and really for all learners, but I think those students in particular, these sentence stems. So that so students can answer those prompts. They have a place to start and they can answer the prompts using the word. And notice that it's really important that they use the word. So in both of these sentence stem answers where we help students get started, the word distribution is contained in that sentence stem. Okay, so if you are in the elementary grades, this is the routine that I like to use and the map structure. And again, your map may look a little bit different, but I think as long as you include those aspects of effective vocabulary instruction, you're off to a good start. But if you teach the middle or high school grades and you're thinking, okay, this is great, but it maybe looks like it's a little more appropriate for elementary, I have a solution for you. So here is a sample vocabulary map that we use and have developed as part of our work on this project that Kim mentioned at the beginning of our session called Middle School Matters. And this is a really amazing project where we did a lot of development work with middle school teachers to develop materials that were effective for integrating evidence-based literacy practices across content areas. So in science, social studies, and English language arts. So what you'll notice about this map, it has almost all of the same components. It's a little bit of a different setup. It's less busy. But one thing that I really like about this is that we do provide the cognate or the translation for English learners at the top. And that's something that you could add to the other map if you wanted to, but it has a student-friendly definition, synonyms or related words, the 2 example sentences, one that connects to students' everyday lives, one that connects to the unit of study, the visual representation or the illustration, and then finally the 2 turn and talk questions. So very similar, but a bit different layout, and maybe the morphemic analysis piece isn't here. So that's something that you could add if you wanted to for your students. But I wanted to show you this example because this is one that was created related to a social studies text. You'll see that globe icon at the top. And then this was a map for the word analyze that was created related to a science text. And then this was one created around a text and a unit of study in English language arts reading. So all within the middle grades. So I want you to note that because these maps can be used across and should be used across content areas to support students' content area reading understanding. So use whichever version, and this one I'm going to give you as well. So use whichever version you find most useful, and that will be, and try them both maybe, that will be most appropriate for your students. All right, let me just check my time here. And of course, I'm a little behind, but that's okay. We'll be fine. All right. Magic $1 million question. How do you choose which words to teach? So here's what I'm going to say about that. There is not a golden answer for this question. And if you and I were to sit down, we may come up with different tier 2 words for that passage. And what I'm going to tell you is that I think that's okay. I think that when you're selecting words, and this is also rooted in recommendations from research, there are a couple of guiding principles that I want you to think about. So ask yourself, what do students know about the topic for instruction? So what knowledge are they bringing to the table? What vocabulary in this text is important for understanding the topic and text? Which words will students encounter again and again? So those are those frequently used words. And then which words have multiple meanings? So those are some really helpful guiding questions that I want you to think about. But there's really 2 key big ideas that I want you to walk away with. So tomorrow, when you're teaching, or I don't know, you're going on a walk outside, bring this up to yourself and say, what were those 2 guiding principles for choosing which words to teach? This is, if you walk away with nothing else tonight, I want you to walk away with this. So the first is that you want to choose words that are high content value. So that means that those words are critical to understanding the passage. So you can think about this in another way. If students don't know those words, they're really going to have difficulty getting anything out of that passage. So first, high content value. The second key principle is high utility. So what's encompassed there is words that our students will see frequently across different situations, domains, contexts, and it also incorporates words that have multiple meanings. So those are the two guiding principles that I want you to walk away with. Say them to yourself right now: high content value and high utility. So remember those two guiding principles. I think that if you focus on tier 2 words that meet those two criteria or guiding principles, your students are going to be in a good spot. So don't fret over, oh my gosh, is it distribution or state? Which one should I teach? Just get going and choose a tier 2 word that meets those two guiding principles. And I think you'll be in a good spot, and so will your students. So don't fret a lot over the decision, but use those principles to guide your decisions and you'll be in a good spot. In terms of the number of words to teach, and I know you guys are wondering about this as well. So what the experts recommend, and you can read a little bit about this in the IES practice guides as well, is remember that we want these words to stick. So students need to have multiple opportunities to practice across contexts. We also need to incorporate in some review, which I didn't include. We can talk about that maybe in the Q&A because I didn't include that in the slides. But students need to cycle back and review these terms. But what's recommended is that for, a single passage, and I'm not talking about like a paragraph like the water cycle, but a longer passage of several paragraphs that students may even read across several days. You want to choose 2 to 3 words. Maybe your students can do 4, but you want to aim for 2 to 3. So doing 10 to 15 in a week, I think is too much. So use this kind of as your guide, but know that be flexible and that you know your students best. And if you think you can do a bit more, that's fine too. Okay. Now let's let's come back to this, and I'm going to have you guys jump in the chat. Given these guiding principles, let's apply it. So say to yourself now, what were those 2 guiding principles? I hope you're saying them to yourself. High and high. So high utility and high content value. It's a little bit weird talking to myself and not getting a response, but hopefully you guys were able to recall those. So now go back and think about your tier 2 words and those 2 principles, and which 2 would you choose to teach for this passage? And go ahead and drop that in the chat. Okay, so I see distribution, surface. I think surface is a great one. States and distribution, I agree. Great, state and surface. I think, surface is a great one because we can talk about the actual, like the surface of the table. We can also think about, the surface of Earth, but we can think about kind of having a surface level understanding, or even when we think about kind of moods and what's on the surface of what's going on here. Yeah, good. Contained. I think contained can be a good one too. I would argue that surface may not be as high content value for this passage as some of the other ones that you guys are identifying. So I think distribution is pretty important to understanding the life cycle and hydrology and what we're talking about, learning about in the water cycle. But I think surface may not be as important as, say, state and distribution. So good. All right. I'm glad to see that you guys are thinking about this and applying these guiding principles. And let's go ahead and what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you what this looks like in action. And then we'll move into kind of how you pull together these, how you create these maps. So a couple of things to think about when you teach these words is that you want to have a copy that you're displaying, and students should have their own copy. They should be following along with you and responding to your prompts. They should be engaged and demonstrating their understanding of the words during the turn and talks. They also, should be completing and filling out the sections of the map with you as you're going through that teacher-led part at the top. So, students are involved and engaged, even though it's quote unquote teacher led. And then you want to, we'll bring in Dr. Archer's term, that perky pace. You want to teach it with a, brisk, perky pace. So you should be able to do this with about 5 minutes per word. And we want to think about this is pre-teaching before students get to reading the text. We don't want students to spend 30 minutes on vocabulary and then only 10 or 15 minutes reading the text. We want the bulk of the time to be reading and discussing the text with this supportive part at the beginning for learning the vocabulary terms. Now, when you initially start this, it's going to take longer, and that's okay. While students are learning the routine and you're getting accustomed to it, it will take a longer time, and that's all right. Be kind to yourself in that way, and you'll get faster, and so will students as you get more accustomed to it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is model this top part of the map for state. So you guys saw the map for that passage on distribution, and now I'm going to show you what this looks like for the word state, how the map would actually look in action. And remember, this top portion is teacher-led, so that's what I'm going to go over, and then we'll just kind of briefly discuss the other pieces. So just as you all are in your spaces and the Virgin Islands and Australia and Kansas and Georgia, wherever you are, just humor me and act like my students so that you can kind of see what this looks like. I won't be able to hear you, but I'm going to trust that you guys are responding in your respective locations. Okay, so before we read, we're going to learn about an important word, state. So I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, I already know this word because we live in the state of Georgia. And you're right. You know one meaning of this word, but there's another meaning of this word that is specific to our science definition and for the passage that we're going to read. So I want to tell you about a different meaning for the word state. So put your finger on the word at the top. And I want you to say the word. So the word is state. What's the word? Good. Excellent. Now I want you to put your finger on box number 1 for our definition. So state is the physical condition of matter. So remember that we've been learning about matter in science, and matter can be in different forms, a solid, a liquid, or a gas. And so, for example, when we think about this definition, the physical condition of matter, let's think about when matter changes. So when snow melts, when the temperature rises, that snow, which is a solid, it becomes a liquid. So the state or the condition of the matter changes. So let's underline the key words in our definition. What do you think are the key words that we should underline in this definition? Good. I heard you say physical. Excellent. We're going to underline physical. What other words? Condition. Very good. And anything else? The physical condition of matter. Matter. Yep. That seems pretty important too. Excellent. I'm glad that you guys identified those. Now let's move on to our box 2. Put your finger on the illustration. So let's look at this illustration, and I want you to think about how this helps us to remember the meaning of state or conditions of matter. So how do you see different states or conditions of water in this picture? How do you see different states or conditions of matter? Okay, good. I see over here there's rain, so this is liquid. So we see the liquid state of matter over here. What else? Oh, excellent. That's right. Here I see solid. We see snow. So that's a solid state or condition of matter, and any other states of matter that we see. That's right. Up here, we see a gas. So as the water evaporates from the sun and the heat, it becomes a gas and goes into the atmosphere. So excellent. You guys identified 3 states or conditions of matter in that illustration. Let's move on to the example sentences. So now I want you to put your finger on box 3. So I'm going to read sentence A and B, and then we're going to think about how these sentences describe changing states of matter. So sentence A says, when my dad boils water to cook spaghetti, the steam rising up from the pot is a gaseous state. So how does this sentence describe changing states of matter? What do you guys think? That's right. So when the water boils and you see the steam rising up, then the liquid changes states into a gas. Excellent. So that's the changing state of matter in that example. What about sentence B? When water droplets form inside of clouds, water changes states from a gas to a liquid. So in sentence B, how is a changing state of matter described? Excellent. So that's right. As the water droplets accumulate in a cloud, they get heavier, and then the gas droplets come together and they form a liquid as they get heavier, and it falls to the ground or to earth, which becomes rain. Excellent. So you guys did a great job of describing changing states of matter in those two sentences. Now let's move on to our box number 4. I want you to put your finger on our related and unrelated words. So we're going to go through each of these, and we're going to talk about whether these terms are related or unrelated to our science definition for the word state. So let's talk about the territory, the first word. Is territory related or unrelated to state? Now, as an aside, you guys, I just want to tell you, don't let them get away with just saying related or unrelated or yes or no. You want to make sure that they actually explain. And I find it's helpful to put a sentence stem here. Blank is or is not related to state because, and that sentence stem is not here, but that's definitely a change that you could make in your own maps. So great. I hear that somebody said territory is unrelated because it has to do with an area or space, land. That's right. So that actually connects with our other definition of state. Remember, Georgia is a territory. So that is one meaning of the word state, but it's not our science definition that we're talking about today. So we're going to put an X through that. And then, similarly, you could also put an X through land as you're discussing that. All right, let's talk about the next word, which is form. Is form related or unrelated? That's right. Form is kind of like a condition. So we could say what form is the matter? Is it a solid, liquid, or gas? We can also similarly say what's the state or the condition. So that seems like a word that might be related. Let's go ahead and circle that one. So you guys, oh no, let me do one more. So what about express? Is express related or unrelated? That's right. It's unrelated because when you state something, you're expressing, for example, if you state your opinion, that means you're expressing or you're saying your opinion, but that's also a different meaning for the word state, not what we're learning about as we're talking about hydrology and the changing states of matter. So you guys kind of get the idea of, good. I appreciate Jean humoring me and answering me in the chat box. Thanks, Jean. Okay, so you guys get the idea of how that works. Now for word parts, this word doesn't really lend itself for going through and identifying prefixes and suffixes because it doesn't have any. But you could definitely do that for distribution. Remember, we talked about shun, meaning the process of, and you could talk about the process of distributing something. And the idea here would be to get students to identify those word parts and to really connect it back with how it reinforces and connects with the meaning or the definition that you have up above. So that gives you a bit of an idea. Now I didn't time myself, so I don't know, but I think that took about 5 minutes. So hopefully that gives you guys, kind of a sample of what this might look like as you're teaching this for students. So then students would, of course, highlight the word during reading, and then after reading would come back and write a sentence that applies the correct use of the word state, given the science definition, and then they would respond to those two turn-in talks. So I want to be mindful of the time because I am getting close to being done, and I want to be sure to give you guys a chance for Q&A. So I just want to mention that when you're thinking about creating these, they look like they're not that hard, but they can be a little bit tricky. And I think as you're initially doing this, it can be harder than it seems. So just expect that it may be a little bit difficult, and divide and conquer is the recommendation I'm going to give to you. So choose the template that works best for your students, try different ones. That's totally fine. And then get together with some colleagues and see if you guys can help each other out and divide and conquer so you're not having to create all of these yourself. And if you're using grade level texts and content area learning and standards, then you're going to be choosing vocabulary that's integral to understanding those texts, which you'll likely use the next year. So then you won't have to reinvent or recreate the wheel the following year, and you can reuse them. So again, there are these, two different maps, two versions that we've talked about and you've seen examples of. A couple of just guidelines for each section. When you are coming up with your student-friendly definitions, please provide that. We talked about that. Don't have students look them up in the dictionary, and you be careful, be mindful when you look up a word in the dictionary. And I do this too, as I'm thinking about kind of how I want to frame these words for students. But just be careful because, for example, if you Google distribution, I'll tell you what comes up. Active distributing, something that is distributed, state or manner of being distributed, they're not very helpful at all for understanding that word. So I just would say to you to just be cautious about the dictionary and sort of sending students wild with that. You really don't want to do that because you want to provide the definition, and then be mindful of dictionary definitions and try to put them in more user-friendly terms for students. The other thing is to be mindful of the different multiple meanings, right? So, distribution can mean passing out a flyer, say for a political candidate, but it can also mean how something is spread out, which was really the meaning of it for this particular context. And that's small, it's kind of nuanced, the difference in those two meanings of that word. And so I think that's important for students to have a grasp of, which is one of the reasons we had that example of the Halloween candy versus the distribution of water in the two context sentences. So just be mindful of sort of the nuance in multiple meaning words. Don't use the word in the definition, and you may also want to use an explanation instead of a definition, because some words can be kind of difficult to define. These are two websites that I have found are really helpful for coming up with student-friendly definitions. So learnersdictionary.com and wordcentral.com. So you guys might want to, snap, well, you'll get the slides, so you don't need to snap a picture, but just check those out later. The illustrations sometimes can be tricky because some words are not easily, there's not a picture or an image that captures the meaning. So you might want to think about a related concept or idea that might help get at the meaning of the word. And then of course, just always be mindful that, some things, you want to be respectful of licensing and whether those things can be used in that way. So just be sure to check that. I like to use the filter feature in Google Images, so I know that it's okay to use a particular image. The context boxes, I talked about this previously. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can have the two examples that work are correct. One is related to students' lives and one is related to unit of study. You also can do an example and a non-example. So that non-example could be totally wrong. It also could be the use of that word that applies to another content area or context. So here's a couple of examples. Like with boundary here on the left-hand side of the slide, that first sentence is totally wrong. So that's an example of having, you have a correct sentence and an incorrect sentence. And then for culture, if students are learning the definition of a way of life, which is kind of the social studies definition, they would want to choose people from different backgrounds, have different cultures versus the science definition of that word culture. So you can kind of see that there, are different ways that you can structure that and choose what works for you. And sometimes it may depend on the word, especially if it's a multiple meaning word. That's a great time to get in some practice with that. I already told you I would change this to related and unrelated words. Word parts, I don't think I have, in the interest of time, anything more to say about that or about the sentence writing. Just make sure they don't take the easy way out and copy an existing sentence or the one from the text, frankly. And then the turn and talk is a great opportunity for practice. And I don't think I have any other, I think I've kind of talked about these aspects. I'm going to show you something in resources that will be helpful. A quick note that I want to be sure that everyone is listening when I say this, and that is that the intention is for these materials and the maps, we want them to be freely accessible for teachers. We want to support your vocabulary instruction and your colleagues and We don't want any of these posted online in a way like, say, Teachers Pay Teachers. If you create a bunch of these and sell them, please don't do that, because we want these things to be freely accessible for teachers. So just please respect that for us. And then keep in mind that this is a process, so you'll get better at it with practice. Even, today I found things in the state map that I would change, and that's okay. Just know that it's all right. You can fix it next time. Divide and conquer, so it's not overwhelming to create these. And then once you have them, I mentioned before, you can use them the following year. The last thing I'm going to throw in is don't forget about mathematics. So there's actually a lot of really important vocabulary, and we've done some cool research in this area at Georgia State around vocabulary related to word problem solving. And there's, just consider this word base. There's multiple meanings for that word outside of mathematics. And then there's multiple meanings to the word base within mathematics. So you can see about how complicated I think math can be, because students may have limited vocabulary knowledge to understand the math concepts. So and I'll show you, if you guys are interested in the Q&A, how we adapted the vocabulary map for use with math words. So that's pretty cool too. But you can use this similar routine, but mathified a bit for mathematics vocabulary instruction as well. All right, I'm on the very last section, which is really just resources. So you want to get your camera ready, because I've got some QR codes. So if you've got your phone, get that out. And if you don't do QR codes, totally cool. I'll show you how to access these things as well. So first thing, vocabulary map. If you are interested in either of the vocabulary maps, I have them posted on my website. So that is, you can just scan that QR code to get there. Or you can go to lizstevensphd.com. There is at the top a header, link for presentations. If you click on that, it's going to say enter the password. The password is IDA 2023, all caps. So go to give that a try, and you will be able to download 2 versions of the that elementary map there. Okay. Now the next resource that I want to share with you guys is the Middle School Matters map. Okay, let me go back. Let me just pause for a second. IDA 2023. Remember, this is going to be in the slides too, that will be emailed out to you. So you'll have the information there. So don't worry if you don't get all of this, you'll be able to access it there. IDA 2023. Let me just pause for a second so that you guys can get this. All right. So, and if it's not working, if for some reason it's not working, I will fix it. So you then just try again tomorrow. I promise I'll get it fixed if some of you are unable to access it. All right. So this, you can just Google or just type in greatmiddleschools.org or use the QR code, but this is the Middle School Matters site that contains the vocabulary map for the middle and high school grades. What's awesome about this is that if you check out here where it says resources and you scroll down to instructional toolkits, reading toolkits, there are all of these resources that contain comprehension supportive practice materials that you can utilize. So you'll notice here I've highlighted the essential words routine toolkit. That's where you'll find the vocabulary map. It's in a PowerPoint, so you can easily use the PowerPoint to create and develop those maps. So really cool stuff on this site, and I encourage you guys to go there, but that's where you find the Middle School Matters one. Okay, so this is also, I just have 2 more, so this one and 1 more, and then I'm gonna turn over to Nicole for some questions. So this is the IES practice guide for reading intervention in grades 4 through 9. Recommendation 3 is to build students' world and word knowledge so that they can make sense of text. So if you want to read more about vocabulary instruction and components of that instruction, this is a great resource. And it walks through examples for instruction. I highly recommend it. So definitely check this out. And then the very last thing, and you can Google this too if you're not doing the QR code, but this is a video on YouTube of Dr. Archer doing the turn and talk. And I think, because I can't really model that for you guys since it's just me here. I highly recommend that you watch her do that in a middle school classroom, and you'll see how effective she is, how she moves things along, how short it is, but all students have an opportunity to practice, and also how she monitors and gives feedback as students are doing this. So super cool. Definitely check that out. And with that, I will just conclude and say thank you so much for participating. I appreciate all of you engaging in the chat, and please stay in touch with me. My contact info is on the slide.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Stevens, for presenting tonight. We have just a little bit of time left here, and we've got a lot of questions. There were a lot of questions that came in while you were presenting, and some questions from before. So let me just jump right in. I'm going to do the best I can. I try to consolidate a lot.
And I'll try to be quick.
So quick question about preschool. So would you say that this would still apply in preschool, or would it look different?
Yeah, so I would recommend with preschool, I would recommend building students' oral language aloud and doing a lot of work with modeling. There's a lot with the dialogic reading. I think you can do a lot with that routine. And I would check out the IES practice guides as well, because I think that there might be some additional guidance there. So I would refer you guys to that, but that's a really good question.
Thank you. A question about pre-teaching vocabulary words. Would it change if the text is being read aloud versus if a student's going to be independently reading text? How would you feel?
I think that's a really good question. So I would say if these are, we want students to be challenged. I don't know if Dr. Vaughn talked at all last session about using stretch text, which is talked about in that practice guide. So I would definitely check that out. One of the ways to support struggling readers with accessing grade level text is by reading it aloud and having them follow along, or doing a type of repeated reading where maybe the teacher reads it aloud, students follow along, and then you partner read. So I would still use this even if if text is being read aloud to students. I think the focus should be the texts that are grade level as much as possible, and supporting the content area learning so that we're also building students' content knowledge.
Thank you for that. There were several questions, so I'm going to kind of consolidate them. The questions were around the specifics of the delivery of the instruction, meaning like how long would you anticipate this lesson lasting? How many days a week? Like what would it look like, I guess?
Yeah, so I think that you guys are asking, those are really good questions. So to give you an example, in the upper elementary grades, a routine similar to this was implemented in 2 social studies lessons. And 2 words were taught prior to reading. And I think 2 or 3 lessons were implemented per week. So I think it was just 2 actually. So 4 words were taught per week. Now that was in a general ed setting, but I think in a smaller group or an intervention setting, you could do 2 words tied to a text. And I think you should be able to do a map that beginning portion in about 5 minutes. Now, I think the bottom part, when students come back to that after reading, may take a little bit more time, but definitely the top portion, you should be able to do both words in like 8 to 10 minutes and then get right to text reading.
Okay. When it comes to the vocabulary map, would you create that in advance of teaching the lesson, or would you do it like while you're teaching the lesson?
No.
Is it pre-prepared? Like, is it all like actually scripted out and written, or are you writing it?
So you definitely want to create your maps before you teach your lesson, because you want to pre-teach those words before students read the text. And again, you want to, use those two guiding principles. So know what text your students are going to read, and then you want to choose your words in line with that. And as far as what you're going to say, I mean, you could definitely write that out. But I think, we script that out in our intervention studies for our tutors, but that's really just your personal preference. If you would feel better kind of writing out what you want to say versus kind of doing it on the fly, that I defer to each individual.
Okay. How would you handle a word that has multiple meanings if you're doing the vocabulary map? Would you put the multiple meanings on one map for the word, or will you do a separate map for each word, or how would you handle that?
That is a great question. I think that's where, if you notice when I modeled state, that's where I think you can build in some of that connecting with those other meanings and differentiating how the science definition, like for example, let me go back to that map, how the science, state meaning expressing, right? So here, over here in the synonyms and antonyms, we were able to kind of have some discussion about that, like express and say and territory and land are all multiple meanings, but they do not connect with our our science definition of state. So I think that's one way to incorporate that. Another way to incorporate the multiple meanings is through these example sentences. So I did not do that in this particular map, but you could do that. I could have said, the politician states that blah, 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 which would have been a different, meaning for that, for a multiple meaning example.
And a question came in around teaching students who are in tier 3, who you feel like you need to teach tier 1 words. Would you use the same map for teaching a tier 1 vocabulary word as teaching a tier 2?
Yeah, I would. I think, some tier 1 words are simpler, and so you may not have to go as in depth, but I would use the same, because the routine in the map includes those components of effective vocabulary instruction. So yeah, I would still use those for sure.
Okay. And just to clarify, you would recommend teaching 2 words per lesson regardless of grade. So whether the student is in 3rd grade or 8th grade or high school, that's still the general rule of thumb.
Yeah. So I think that's and I know everybody wants a hard and fast answer. And I think that's a really hard question to give a hard and fast answer to. I would say as a general rule of thumb, yes, too. And that's kind of what in some of the practice guides they recommend is 2 to 3. But I think you have to think about your students. I think grade level is a factor, how quickly they pick up the words, how extensive the text is. Maybe are they reading the text over multiple days? And if you're doing some review, so maybe you're not introducing as many new words if you're also doing some review of previously taught words. So I think 2 is a good rule of thumb prior to a new text, or say, in a lesson. But I would, just the caveat is to kind of be mindful of your students and we want to go for depth in word knowledge and not, teaching a lot of words that students just have a surface level understanding. So I'm sorry, that's not like a hard and fast answer, but it's a little bit nuanced.
Okay, thank you for that. A question about how is spelling related to teaching vocabulary?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think that there's a helpful aspect, I think, with, the morphemic analysis that can also help students with their spelling. So breaking these words apart and teaching these units or word parts, I think can have a reciprocal positive impact also on students' writing. And so I think, and spelling of words. So, and the other thing I think is you want to be in the writing the powerful sentence, you would want to hold students accountable for spelling that target word correctly there. So I think it's an opportunity to provide feedback on student spelling. But I do think that that morphemic analysis is a helpful thing. The other thing that we haven't really talked about tonight, and this, my colleague Christy, who I stole that slide from, well, I didn't steal it, she let me borrow it. But her line of research, which is really cool, looks at teaching word meaning and how that influences students' word reading. And so I think that that's also an interesting, this can also help students to be able to read these words in text. Because when you're more familiar with the word, and if we think about, flexible word reading strategies, and being able to tweak pronunciations of words, you have to have knowledge of those words in order to be able to do that. And so I do think that this can also support students' word reading of longer multisyllabic words. That's a little bit of a tangent, Nicole.
I know, sorry about that. So I just have maybe one more quick question, and it was just, can you explain why it's important to have examples and non-examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that's just one of the practices that has been identified by researchers as supporting students' vocabulary learning. I think if you think about it in terms of, sort of like a boundary of understanding, when you really are learning a new word, it's helpful to know what it is and what it is not. And so, those can also be in visuals. It doesn't necessarily have to be, because a non-example would also be an appropriate use of the word, but for another context, right? That's not the science definition of state. So it really helps students to solidify their understanding of that word in the particular context that you're teaching, to know what it is and what it is not. So I hope that helps.
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I think I'm going to wrap it up because we're going to be very respectful of your time this evening. So thank you again, Dr. Stevens, for tonight's presentation and discussion on vocabulary instruction during content-based lessons. We really appreciate all that you've shared with us. And thank you to everyone out there who joined us this evening. If you have colleagues who missed tonight's webinar, just please let them know that within 24 to 48 hours, all registrants will receive a link to the webinar and to Dr. Stevens' presentation slides. All registrants, including anyone who's on a waiting list, can also fill out a knowledge check request form for a certificate of attendance after either viewing the presentation live tonight or the recorded version. That form is going to be sent out early next week, and registrants will have approximately 1 week to submit the form. So those who fill it out, you will receive your certificate of attendance the day after the deadline for submission. On behalf of the IDA Georgia and the Reading League Georgia, we appreciate you attending our webinar this evening. We know that some of you attended the entire series, and we hope you learned a lot from our speakers. Thanks for your questions and your support of this series. Please check the IDA Georgia and the Reading League Georgia websites for upcoming events, including IDA Georgia's Team Talk on April 25th and the Dimensions of Dyslexia Conference on Saturday, August 26th. The conference will be held at Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. And it will be IDA Georgia's first in-person conference since before the pandemic. The theme for the conference is going to be the keys to structured literacy. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.